I could see the tears in her eyes as she looked at the quilt squares that blanketed the National Mall. Seeing her outward signs of distress, I felt nervous about approaching her, but I was an emotional support volunteer at the Monument Quilt Display honoring survivors of domestic and sexual violence last year, so it was my job to offer assistance. So I slowly approached her and asked if I could offer any assistance. At first, this woman said she didn't need any help, but then she continued to talk, and parts of her story came pouring out. It turns out that decades earlier, she'd been violently abused by her boyfriend at the time. She told me that back in those days, there wasn't a common language for things like domestic violence or rape. Instead, she shared with me that for decades, she would talk about her experiences with abuse by saying it was the bad thing I went through. As her eyes scanned the 3,000 quilt squares that stretched across the National Mall, she told me that she thought she would never in her lifetime see something like this. The Monument Quilt was the end result of years of work by an organization called Force out of Baltimore. They had spent years hosting quilting workshops for abuse survivors across the country, and this culminating event with a display on the National Mall was held on the weekend of June 1st last year. The date of June 1st probably isn't all that significant to most of you. And in fact, it wasn't until I was in Washington, D.C., the day before June 1st, that I realized the significance of that date for me. It just so happened that that exact date, June 1st, many years earlier, was the exact date that I myself had become free from an abusive relationship. Leaving that abusive relationship had been a long, emotional journey for me. It had been hard to talk about what I'd been going through and to reach out for help. And I was so afraid that I'd be judged or viewed as weak for getting involved with an abusive partner. It had taken me a long time to come to terms with my own story of surviving an abusive relationship. And yet last year, on June 1st, there I was, standing in the middle of the National Mall among thousands of survivors' stories and realizing that my own story was having a full circle moment. In that moment, I also was reminded, perhaps more deeply than ever, just how much we need forums for survivors of sexual and domestic violence to share their stories. In addition to my personal experiences, I've learned about the importance of survivor stories in many ways during my years working in the mental health, domestic violence, and healthy relationship promotion fields. When I worked as a full-time counselor, clients who were survivors would share their stories of physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, and financial abuse, and I would watch them transform before my eyes while they worked through the difficult parts of their stories and reclaimed the empowering parts. When I've supported friends who were in or leaving an abusive relationship, I've seen the power of the seemingly simple act of listening to help someone take steps forward in their journey toward healing and recovery. And when I've listened to survivors publicly share their stories at countless community awareness events, I've witnessed the power of survivors' stories to inspire others to action, break through common stereotypes about abuse, and help educate people about what life with an abusive partner is really like. In fact, it was the power of survivor stories that changed the course of my career and compelled me to change the way that I approached my work as a researcher within the ivory towers of academia. You see, about 10 years ago, in my work as a professor at UNC Greensboro, a colleague and I began studying the ways that survivors of intimate partner violence experience stigma. We started this research as a purely scholarly endeavor, and our research began with 12 in-person interviews with survivors of past abuse. So far to date, that same line of research has grown to collecting the stories of over 1,250 survivors. And yet, even over 1,000 research participants later, it's still the story of one of the very first women that I interviewed that I remember most clearly, and that changed the course of our research in a huge way. And it was an interview that almost didn't happen. I remember waiting in my office for this woman to arrive. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I'm usually on time and I keep a really tight schedule. But this woman was running very, very late, and I could feel my impatience growing with each passing minute. I was getting nervous that we wouldn't have time to do the interview, and I was just about to give up hope that she was coming when she called to tell me that she was almost there. When she arrived, we were both a bit flustered, but we settled into the interview, and she started telling me the story about how she'd been horribly beaten and verbally abused by her ex-boyfriend, who also was the father of her child. As we moved on to discussing ways that she'd experienced stigma, she shared with me that people would ask her if she was embarrassed to have been abused. And this is what she said. "The only thing that bothers me about it is that other people can't see the triumph in it, because to me, this is a treasure to be at this point in my life, in this stage, and it be beginning. Some people don't even start to realize that they have the issues or start dealing with them until they get to this point." 3 words rang in my ears for days following this interview. See the triumph. It was such a powerful way to look at the experiences of survivors of abuse, and I couldn't get those 3 words off my mind. So often, when people think about those who've been abused, they see victims or survivors as weak or damaged. But what this woman's story and the stories of so many other survivors make clear is that surviving abuse is about a daily process of triumphing over hurt and trauma. As we continued our research collecting stories from survivors, we started hearing over and over and over again that the survivors were sharing their stories with us because they wanted to help others. Instinctively, they seemed to understand that if they could share their stories with others, another person facing abuse might hear their story and be inspired to take steps towards safety, or possibly recognize the signs of abuse before getting deeply involved with an abusive partner. Now, if you're familiar with academia, you know that the traditional way to share research findings is through peer-reviewed journal articles. But we knew that the stories survivors were sharing with us wouldn't reach the people they wanted to reach through peer-reviewed journal articles. So we knew we had to do more. From there, after much planning, on January 1st, 2013, the See the Triumph social media campaign was born. And in the 7.5 years since that time, the campaign has grown to a community with thousands of members across our social platforms. Our mission through See the Triumph is to end the stigma surrounding abuse and to develop supportive resources for survivors. Now, statistics can help us to overcome the stigma surrounding abuse in that they can show the scope of the vast numbers of people who've experienced abuse. For example, the CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey tells us that 1/4 of women and 1/10 of men in the United States have faced negative impacts from physical, sexual, and/or stalking abuse by an intimate partner at some point in their lives. When you factor in psychological aggression, over 1/3 of both women and men in the United States have been negatively impacted by some form of intimate partner abuse during their lifetimes. Considering that so many people have experiences with abuse, why is it that violence and abuse remain relatively hidden, stigmatized issues? And perhaps more importantly, why, when so many people are affected by abuse, do those of us who faced abuse feel so alone and ashamed in our experiences? The stigma surrounding domestic and sexual violence presents many barriers to healing for individual survivors, as well as for preventing and responding to abuse at the community level. But what we've seen from our research is that the stigma surrounding abuse does not stand up to the actual stories of survivors. Stigma tells us that abuse only happens to certain types of people, but survivor stories show that anyone from any background can become victimized. Stigma suggests that victims and survivors are somehow at fault or to blame for the abuse that they experienced, but their stories highlight just how fully responsible their abusers are for their abusive actions. And the stigma surrounding abuse leads people to believe that a victim could easily leave an abusive partner. But survivor stories show just how physically, emotionally, and financially entrapped they become in their relationships. Survivor stories matter for challenging the stigma that contributes to still high rates of violence and abuse, even in a day and age when most people understand the harmful impacts of these forms of abuse for individuals and communities. Whether or not you have personal experiences of abuse in your own life, you can play an important role in overcoming abuse and the stigma that surrounds it. There are 3 key ways that you can get involved. First, understand the importance of survivors' stories in their journey toward healing and recovering from past abuse. I do want to speak briefly to those of you who are also survivors. If you faced abuse in your own life, know that your story matters. You have a unique and important story to tell, but also know that it's completely your own choice whether, when, how, and to whom you share your story. If one day you decide to stand in front of a large public audience or look into a news camera and share your story for all to hear, that is sure to be a powerful moment for you that will also help and inspire others. But sharing your story can be just as powerful even if you only tell a small group of close friends or a professional counselor, or even if you just write it out for yourself in a private journal. It's not necessary for survivors of abuse to publicly share their stories in order to be healed from those experiences. And in fact, there are many reasons why someone may choose never to do so, including that it might not be safe. But whether publicly or privately, owning and retelling one's story of surviving abuse can be an important part of the healing process for survivors. And this brings me to the second key way that we can all help overcome abuse and the stigma that surrounds it, and that is to be ready to listen and offer support if someone you know is facing an abusive relationship. It's important to understand common signs or red flags of abuse. Even someone who's very close to you may not be comfortable disclosing those experiences to you. Some common signs to look for include seeming fearful of or being controlled by your partner, becoming more socially isolated as the relationship goes on, and being followed or monitored electronically. Trust your instincts, and if you have concerns about a loved one's relationship, let them know, but do so in a way that invites them to share their experiences and doesn't convey judgment or blame. When someone impacted by abuse starts sharing their story with you, know that you can make a huge difference in their life simply by listening and being present. Beyond simply listening, however, there are at least 5 additional ways that you can offer support. First, believe them. Abusers can be very manipulative and deceptive, and this can lead victims and survivors to question their own reality. Believing survivors' stories helps empower them to start believing themselves again. Second, validate the hurt and pain in their experiences. Abusers also tend to minimize or deny the extent to which they're hurting their partners, and this can lead victims and survivors to deny their own feelings as well. You can help validate their emotions and experiences by acknowledging the pain they faced. So, for example, you might say, "You have been through so much," or "You've lived through such a nightmare." Third, avoid blame and judgment. An abuser is always 100% responsible for the abuse that they carry out. However, they'll often place blame onto the very person that they're hurting. When listening to a survivor share their story with you, always affirm that the abuser was fully responsible for their actions and avoid any subtle or blatant implications of blame and judgment for the victim or survivor. Fourth, give them time and space. It takes time to process experiences of abuse. Telling one's story doesn't have to happen all at once. Offer survivors the time and space they need to share their story with you on their own terms. And fifth, ask how you can help. Now, it might be tempting to just jump in and offer help, but keep in mind that the type of help that you may want to offer may not be the help that that person most needs in that moment. The best way to offer help is by asking if they'd like your help, and if so, what help do they most need right now? Beyond individual efforts to help survivors, the third way that we can all help overcome abuse and the stigma surrounding it is by getting involved in our community's efforts to support victims and survivors, hold offenders accountable, and prevent future violence and abuse. Every community has a unique set of resources and organizations that address abuse. Typical resources include law enforcement, social service agencies, victim advocates, and mental health professionals. It's important to understand the resources in your community in case you or someone you know ever needs help. It's also critical for community members to support these local organizations, whether through financial contributions, volunteering, or helping to raise awareness in the community. I've worked alongside many of these organizations for years, and I can tell you that a common theme is that they're almost always underfunded and face extremely high volumes of clients. Here in Guilford County, North Carolina, we're fortunate to have a Family Justice Center, which is a national model for coordinated victim services that's designed to offer a one-stop shop where victims can get the help they need within a single location. When our planning committee first came together to begin envisioning what would eventually become the Guilford County Family Justice Center, our mission was not to build a new standalone organization. Instead, we were working together to build a system that would make it easier for victims to get the help they needed from existing resources and services without having to risk their safety and waste precious minutes running around all over town. Today, within our Family Justice Center here, victims can get help from law enforcement, speak with a victim advocate, file for an emergency protective order, and seek legal advice, among many other critical resources and services. The numbers of people seeking help from our local Family Justice Center give another glimpse into the extent to which violence and abuse impact our communities. Since June 2015, when the first location of the Guilford County Family Justice Center first opened, just over 5 years ago, the center has already served over 38,000 primary and secondary victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, elder abuse, and child maltreatment right here in our community. When we hear that number, we can no longer ignore the pervasive impact that violence and abuse have on our communities and society. The people working in community response organizations like the Family Justice Center do great and important work, but they need our help. They need the backing of their communities to continue to provide effective services and to stay healthy and well themselves. There's a Native American proverb that says, "It takes 1,000 voices to tell a single story." The story of domestic and sexual violence in our society is one that can only be told by listening to and honoring the stories of individual survivors. Every survivor has a story. Every survivor's story of triumphing over abuse matters. Every story is unique, and yet collectively, the stories of survivors can be woven together to inspire change, challenge stigma, and offer hope and healing. Whether or not you have any experiences of abuse in your own life, I invite you to listen to and honor the stories of survivors until one day, when the only story left to tell is how everyone came together to put an end to violence and abuse once and for all. Thank you.